Next up, we have got a colleague of mine, actually, Rayyan Zafar, who is from drug science. And Rayyan is a research postgraduate for Imperial College London Centre for Psychedelic Research and Neuropharmacology Group. Some of you may have heard of them. And he works alongside our head of research at Drug Science, Dr. Anne Schlag, on groundbreaking research, publishing scientific and policy reports as part of the Drug Science Medical Cannabis Working Group and the Medical Psychedelic Working Group. So please welcome Rayyan.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Mag said, I work at the Centre for Psychedelic Research, but today I'm going to be talking to you about the research we've been doing at Drug Science, particularly in medical cannabis over the last few years. As also mentioned, so since 2018, there's only been 3 prescriptions made of whole plant medical cannabis in the UK, which is disastrous. I'm going to go into some of the reasons why that's happened and how we can change that over now. So yeah, medical cannabis has been around for around 5,000 years. So started in India before Christ, and then headed over through the Middle East, up through Africa, and only actually entered Europe in around the 1900s, where it was presented at the Royal Society after an Irish physician went to India and found out that medical cannabis was actually working for many Indians that were living in different parts of the world. So Queen Victoria famously used medical cannabis to help menstrual stress. From the 1850s to the early 1940s, there was many advertisements in the US which showed that it worked for pain and different sorts of medical conditions. And actually there was over 3 million prescriptions per year in the US in the 1920s. But the 1920s is famous in the US with the start of Prohibition. And it was actually at the end of a disastrous period of time that at the end of the 1930s, there was a redundant DEA force, so they're the Drugs Enforcement Agency, who were tasked initially with making sure that alcohol wasn't sold in the US, but they needed to find something new to target, and so cannabis became the new evil. So over the ensuing decades, President Nixon, a few industries such as the cotton industry and the pulp industry, as well as some rogue prescribing done in the UK, led in 1971 for the Misuse of Drugs Act to classify cannabis as a drug with no medicinal value and one that is very highly addictive and causing dependence. Yeah, Harry Aslinger, who led the charge on this in the 1930s, said that marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of the world. So yeah, that's where we were at the end of the 1970s. So if you click next. So many of you may know or have seen Hannah Deacon and Alfie Dingley and heard about their stories. So Alfie was diagnosed with a very rare form of epilepsy. There's only 3 children in the world that have his condition. And it was in 2018, after having been in the Netherlands to access medical cannabis, that Alfie went without a seizure for 42 days. Now, Hannah wanted to come back to the UK and carry on living her life here, and appealed to Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, and Theresa May at the time to allow for medical cannabis prescriptions to be made available in the UK. And he was the recipient of the first medical cannabis prescription. But there have been examples, and the other famous example was Billy Caldwell. So Billy's mother had been outside of the UK, and she brought in medical cannabis back in through customs, and customs officials actually took the medicine off her. Billy went into status epilepticus, which is a very dangerous condition, was rushed to pediatric intensive care unit and intubated for 5 days. So he, after his medical cannabis was taken away from him, he went back into severe forms of epilepsy. And it was only after the drug was given back to him that he was able to become seizure-free again. So, Hannah and Alfie are a success story, and so is Billy Caldwell. So they're the 2 children of the 3 NHS whole plant medical cannabis prescriptions that have been provided. But there are a lot of other children in the UK that are using medical cannabis, but are having to fund it themselves to get it off the black market because it's almost impossible to access it in the NHS. And so 2 charities that we've worked with at Drug Science, End Our Pain and MedCan Support, we've collected data on, and I'll go on to tell you a little bit about that in a second. So we have some of the easiest medical cannabis prescribing laws in the world, actually, in the UK, which many people don't know about. So it can be prescribed for any condition, but you just need to be a specialist. So the law change was actually quite proactive in 2018. And NICE made some recommendations. So NICE recommends for these 3 different conditions. So if you're under chemotherapy, sometimes you may have vomiting or nausea, and THC seems to be quite effective to treat that. If you suffer from MS, a combined THC CBD spray seems to help with spasticity, so it helps you with relaxing your joints and being able to move a lot easier. And then, as I mentioned before, there's been some research with severe treatment-resistant epilepsy, and a specific isolated cannabinoid called CBD has been shown to be effective in phase 3 clinical trials. Now, I just want to note here that the CBD product is not whole plant medical cannabis. I'll go on to explain a little bit about the differences between that in a second. But what happened after these recommendations is that doctors were not prescribing it because they felt restricted to these guidelines. And so one of the families that we've worked with, Matt Hughes, he actually took NICE to court because he said that these restrictive guidelines were badly affecting children like his son and other families around the UK. And actually NICE came back and said, finally, that NICE made no population-wide recommendation, and healthcare professionals should not be prevented from considering the use of unlicensed cannabis medicinal products where they think it's appropriate. So they concluded that there is no recommendation against the use of cannabis prescribing. So even though they make recommendations for these 3 areas, it's not to say that you can't prescribe in those areas. So that clarification was something that was very important in order to try to change the needle slightly with these families. So the Centre for Medical Cannabis predict that 1.4 million individuals in the UK are using medical cannabis cannabis for medical purposes. And obviously a majority of these will be coming off the black market and not through private prescriptions. We know around 12% of epilepsy users are using medical cannabis, but as I mentioned, there's only been 3 NHS prescriptions. So there's a massive treatment gap within this field. And when we compare ourselves to other countries in general, we are shockingly behind. So our neighbours on continental Europe reimburse through their medical and private public healthcare systems medical cannabis. But in the UK, we're a very long way behind that. And then over the pond in Canada and the US, many of you know that there's been a sweeping legalization, medicalization, reform program going on for years. So we're a long way behind, but this is not necessarily a bad thing, because now we do have partners and, nations that we are, politically aligned with, that we can learn lessons from. And this paper written by Anne Schlag, who I work with, goes into some of those ways how we can learn lessons from these nations. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, there's a few barriers to prescribing, which mainly come from doctors. So due to the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, so if you see this, the graph on the right-hand side, this is just a quick PubMed search. So that's where all scientific literature gets published. And if you look at this little crest over here, that's when the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act came in. And you can see that medical research in the field largely ceased for a period of around 40 years because of that act. But then if you go to 2022, there's around 3,800 publications a year now of medical cannabis. And I think at the peak, it was around 400 a year. So we're now living in an era where we know a lot more about how cannabis works, how medical cannabis works. But it's a shame because, I mean, if that act wasn't brought in, we would have been, miles ahead of where we are today. And so the other kind of barrier to access, apart from lack of education and lack of research, is also the cost of medical cannabis. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a few slides. So cannabis has 450 compounds, and you can split them off between non-cannabinoids. So these are terpenes and flavonoids, which give the smell and the taste. And you've got cannabinoids. So you have the euphoric one. So THC is the one that gets you stoned. And that is, and there's some other ones as well. And you have non-euphoric ones such as CBD, which I mentioned before. So there's a plethora of different compounds within medical cannabis, but only the CBD one is currently licensed for individuals with epilepsy. Yeah. And the way that this interacts with the body is we have something called an endocannabinoid system. So our bodies over time, through human evolution, have decided that this is an important kind of self-regulating homeostatic mechanism. So the endocannabinoid system has 10 times as many receptors as the dopamine and serotonin system combined, but it's not taught about in medical schools or in biomedical science courses, in spite of its sheer abundance in the human body and the fact that we actually make our own cannabinoids inside us. But interestingly, external cannabinoids from the cannabis plant can interact with these receptors. And as you can see here, we have two main cannabinoid receptors distributed around the body. So the CB1 receptor is expressed in the brain, and that's where THC binds. And then in the periphery, in the immune system, you have a lot of these CB2 receptors where other cannabinoids like CBD combine. And essentially, as I mentioned, these two receptors keep the body's physiological processes in check, which is why cannabis is a very widely, there's a lot of indications that people suggest that it could be widely used for. But particularly if we look inside, again, the brain, there's different targets. So it can work in learning and memory, nausea and vomiting, and appetite, movement, and even some cognitive thinking as well. So it can be a very easily targeted and modifiable drug. And with 450 compounds, I predict in the next 10 years, we're going to be seeing a lot of cannabis-based medicines which are targeted to these more specific neurological and psychiatric conditions as well. So we've published on children with epilepsy. So epilepsy is a neurological condition which is defined by seizures. And we found some pretty amazing results, I'd say, from children who've been using whole plant medical cannabis. So we can see that NICE have made a recommendation for CBD, but what about all of the other compounds in cannabis? Do they seem to be helpful? So we wanted to investigate, if you just click a few more times. I'll skip all of this because it's going in a bit too much detail, but essentially we wanted to understand what whole plant medical cannabis does and whether that's different from CBD alone. And what we found is that medical cannabis does seem to have anticonvulsant properties, but THC, which has not been looked into as much, could be also effective. And this is because it works at literally the level of the brain circuits involved in hyperactivity of the brain. So our research has found that over the 21 patients that we've looked at, 3 of them went into complete remission. So this is probably too small for you to see, but some of these patients are having over 10,000 seizures a month. So that's 300 seizures a day these children are having, going in and out of epileptic activity. Some of them are on intravenous steroids, which is a treatment that would eventually have killed them. And yeah, so you can see this patient over here had 18,000 seizures a month and it went down to 0. Across the board, we saw 84% reduction on average in seizures. That represents a 30 to 50-fold decrease in seizure activity in each individual patient. And no currently licensed drugs, so things that are normally conventional anti-epileptic drugs, pass a 50% reduction in seizures. So we're greatly surpassing the efficacy and effectiveness of it with whole plant medical cannabis. And this cannabidiol, which is the isolated cannabinoid, only reaches a response of around 50% in the control clinical trial. So from these 21 patients, what we've determined is that it is more effective, and we think that this is some of the most remarkable sort of science that in epilepsy and pediatric neurology to date, actually. And then when we look at even the brain activities comparing CBD and how CBD isolate versus whole plant medical cannabis, because we want to make sure that actually at the level of the brain, it has an interaction. And you can see a lot more synchronized brain activity occurring with these patients. So based on this data, we think that there's a 96% chance of successful treatment for any child who's resistant to treatment epilepsy. And in medical research, you don't get 96% chances of likelihood. So based on these statistical analysis, we are very certain that this is an important and effective intervention, and it's been published in the British Medical Journal of Pediatrics. So even medical peer reviewer colleagues are very impressed with this data. And we hope that this data will be taken up by clinicians and we're doing quite a lot of campaigning at the moment to get this message out there to those clinicians that can prescribe these products. So everyone knows about this bus. So yeah, if you could just go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit how Brexit has really, really, fucked some of these kids up, to be honest. So this is the average cost of these patients who are spending £1,700 a month in order to get whole plant medical cannabis because they can't access it. That's over £24,000 a year. Bearing in mind, these patients are dealing with children who are having 300 seizures a day. They can't work. So they're having to remortgage their houses. They're having to take out payday loans. They're not able to really financially afford this. But when you compare it to black market cannabis, that's £3,700 a year, you can see that there is a massive imbalance in, does a parent really cripple themselves financially? Do they go to a black market where a product could or could not work? It's not regulated. But then when we compare it versus in the Netherlands, the same medicine that these children are having costs £7,000 a year. So essentially, yeah, what we're trying to say is that in the UK, there seems to be a lack of affordable private prescriptions of medical cannabis. And that's for many reasons, including Brexit. But a cost of 1 day in paediatric ICU costs the government, the NHS £5,000. So the NHS need to be looking at data like this to see that actually it would be a cost saving for them to put medical cannabis into prescribing for these children, because many of these kids are going into ICU for 2-3 weeks at a time, which costs a lot more than some of the private prescriptions that they're having to fund. And so, yeah, this is Alfie. So at the turn of last year, as soon as Brexit kicked in, the medicines that were made available to individuals like Alfie were basically stopped, and some of the children were, really on the lifeline because of this. So we wrote to the government soon after, and we basically wrote to the government and said that they need to. So we got them to agree to a supply, and this was in January 2021. They agreed to have 6 months of supply of the medical cannabis products for these children. But we also wrote to the ACMD, who are in charge of the supply of medical cannabis products too. And we came up with a set of recommendations, which I've noted a few of them over here. But unfortunately, the government don't really seem to be listening, and the ACMD don't really want to hear from us. And we've not heard back from them, but that doesn't stop us. We will continue. And we invited charities and politicians and ministers, and that event landed quite well. And we're now having conversations with individuals in NICE and the MHRA to allow for some of these children to have access to these honestly life-saving medicines. If you just want to skip a few slides, because I've got 1 minute left, but I just want to go to the next slide. So what is next with these patients? Well, we don't really know, but this guy over here, Chris Whitty, doesn't seem to be too much of a fan of medical cannabis, and he thinks that it will cause a thalidomide tragedy. But we actually know that thalidomide went through preclinical toxicology and didn't show teratogenesis, which is something that goes against what, he probably needs to read his science books from the sounds of it. But RCTs as well don't lend themselves very well to medical cannabis development. And so we're trying to push for the government to look into medical cannabis in a different way. If you want to know a little bit more about how we can get patients to access medical cannabis a lot better, David Nutt's written about this quite extensively in the BMJ. But fundamentally, as today's about what can you do, or what can we say, I think the fundamental thing is about applying pressure to regulatory bodies. So these are regulatory bodies such as the BPNA, which basically hold on to doctors and tell them what they should and shouldn't be prescribing. Interestingly, they're funded by the CBD camp. So, there's a lot of political warfare going on, but at the heart of all this are children who seem to be doing amazingly, going back into work, going back in school. The parents are able to go back into work. They're seizure-free for the first time in years. And I think when we think about medical cannabis and we think about the politicization of medical cannabis, what we need to really always remember is that there are children who are benefiting, but a lot more are suffering. And so we need to continue to speak out to the politicians and the naysayers and show them the evidence. And I think it will be an evidence-based approach along with campaigning and spreading the word, that will really land these children and, children of the future in good stead if they suffer from these terrible conditions. Yeah, thank you.
We've got a few minutes now for Q&A before we have a break. Can I ask if there are any questions from the audience? Yes, Tara, I'm going to hand the microphone to you.
Two really, really probably basic bitch questions here. Number one, how do the kids consume the full plant medicine? I'm interested in that. And difference between children and adults in terms of epilepsy and the studies. Do you expect the same thing in adults, or are there significant differences?
Sure, yeah, great question. So yeah, they're not smoking. So it's whole plant medical cannabis oils. So it's a tincture which has lots of different cannabinoids in and THC, and it's given underneath their tongue. So some of them have around, like, say 3 milliliters a day, so 1.5 mils in the morning and then in the evening. And the onset of action is very quick. It happens about 20 minutes or so that they seem to have this kind of relaxation phase. The second question was about adult epilepsy. So we actually know that it seems to work a little bit better in children than it does in adults. We're not entirely sure why that's the case. Perhaps it's because when there's neurodevelopment processes going on in early life and the brain is developing, if you get in early, then you can stop some of these kind of entrenched pathological states from kind of sitting in. So I think if it was to be prescribed en masse, what we would see is that not many adults would transgress into adult epilepsy, because you kind of stop the buck before it starts. And it's an excellent form of preventative medicine if we do that. So if we screen individuals who are more likely to develop epilepsy and then give them the medical cannabis treatment, then there'll be less pressure, or there'll be less individuals that will be turning on to developing adult epilepsy, because it's a lot harder to change a circuit once it's very deeply kind of ingrained in the neural network. So yeah, it works a little bit better in children, but maybe if this is more mass prescribed en masse, we'll see fewer individuals transitioning to adult epilepsy.
Thank you. Other questions? Go on then.
I'm just wondering if you think it might help the cause that we start visualizing the oil, as in showing people oil tinctures. This is what the medicine is. Because I actually think that the minute we're talking about cannabis, we're going to a plant, we know what it looks like, we're thinking about smoking it, and actually taking it away from that may help.
Yeah, I mean, from like a branding point of view, a marketing point of view, I think part of the reason why this worked actually and why the law changed was the shock factor. I'm not going to lie, it was the media really picked it up because they wanted a commotion. And actually, I think in that sense, it really helped the movement, because I think individuals thought it was quite controversial, the idea that THC was being given to kids. And so, but I think now actually oils for doctors specifically and for individuals that are going to be prescribing it, for them, it's probably essential. And I think we overlook actually that not many people know the different ways that medical cannabis is prescribed. We just assume probably from the inside out that, it's an oil. Of course it's not, but yeah, no, that's a really good point. I definitely think we'll consider that.
Yeah, and we were at 420 this week, and it was quite shocking how few people there actually knew about medical cannabis, knew that cannabis was legal for medical purposes, and also the formats come into that as well. People don't realise that it can be consumed but as an oil and dropped under the tongue in that way. They just go to the kind of the recreational format, as it were. So thank you for that, Leonie.
Yeah. Hi. Can you talk a bit about the adverse events that the normal medication, the epileptic medication, has, and how does this compare with the adverse events, if any, from medical cannabis?
Yeah, so anti-epileptic medicine, which is currently available, is actually not very great at all. So there's steroid-based medications, and many clinicians in the crowd, steroid-based medications are very strong. They change neurotransmitter balances, and there's been some evidence that daily, because you have to take these medicines daily, that they cause global developmental delay. So these children don't hit their cognitive milestones. There's actually a little bit of grey matter atrophy, so it destroys their tissue slightly as well. In comparison, we've not seen any adverse events. I mean, the side effects reported are improvements in well-being, improvements in sleep, these kids are able to function. Whenever you look at a severe illness like epilepsy, which is untreatable, it's a risk-benefit balance. When individuals sometimes ask me, oh, but you're giving cannabis to children, that's going to be dangerous. They're not going to be able to, reach their cognitive milestones. I was like, well, the alternative for these children is that they're going to die within 2 years. So actually not being able to get 5 GCSEs, it's not really on the radar for them. Like, you have to kind of balance out what is the possibility for these children. It's not to live, they won't be able to probably live the most normal life like healthy individuals can, but it's about giving them the best opportunity to. So I think when we talk about adverse events, it has to be reflective of what that patient is capable of in the confines of their disorders.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions on Zoom.
Yes, so, so I think you've kind of just answered that last question, this next question with what you just said, but there is an ability to abuse drugs, and I worry that legislation will result in drug abuse being increased. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I think it's a bit ridiculous. I think people are going to use drugs regardless of policy. I mean, that's quite evident given the fact that everyone seems to be. The children in this study as well, the children in this study aren't using the same amount of cannabis in terms of THC content as what's seen in street bought cannabis. And actually, we know that if we regulate street cannabis specifically, so reduce the amount of THC skunk which is available on the street, it could actually reduce a lot of harms that we think may be related to perhaps early onset psychosis, although the links between that are also quite vague. So I think the regulation, so the question was, if we regulate it, are we going to see more? No, absolutely not. I think the medicalization, legalization will make drugs safer. It will actually allow for a more concentrated supply. There's so much adulterants in drugs these days. I mean, yeah.
I'm sorry, am I right in saying that in MMJ states in America, they've seen no statistical increase in teenage consumption of cannabis? Is that correct?
Yeah. So the US is a prime example. So we've got some data which actually shows that initially they thought it would be young individuals that would be turning to the dispensaries, but actually the average age is over 35. There's actually been a reduction in individuals going to seek out cannabis dependency help. So actually the medicalization of it is taking individuals away from probably the high THC cannabis, which may have led to some level of physical dependence. And maybe they were seeking it for medical purposes, and now they're being able to access a much more safer medicine, and therefore putting less strains on the services of addiction clinics in the US. So yeah, no, I think the medicalization and legalization of cannabis will reduce harms to society more broadly.
Awesome. So just a couple of quick ones. What was that acronym that you just used? RC something?
RCTs.
What does RCT stand for?
They stand for randomized control trials. So in medical science, when you want to prove a drug works, you have a drug and you have basically a sugar pill and you randomize it. So half the group get the sugar pill, half the real drug. And the C control just means it's in a setting where it's in a lab. And RCTs are what doctors look for when they want to prescribe a drug, because they see that as being the top of the pyramid of evidence. What we argue is that this is impossible or very difficult with medical cannabis, because cannabis has multiple compounds, not just one, which are used in typical pharmaceutical drug development. And also for rare conditions where there's only a small number of patients, you can't do large RCTs because no one's going to fund it, because the pharmaceutical companies won't make money. So
okay,
quite difficult with cannabis.
We've got a couple of more questions. I've got an adult friend who's severely epileptic, 50 plus seizures a day. Might she benefit?
I mean, it's worth giving it a go.
Yeah. So we're going to drop some links in for the Project 2021 into the chat for you. I'd like to ask, hopefully not too cynically, could Big Pharma be halting this somehow, as it helps people, so they might need less than other medicines?
I don't want to comment too much because I don't know, but I know that there are some pharmaceutical companies, cannabis pharmaceutical companies, that are quite serious about trying to get whole plant medicines to patients. But I just don't think there's enough research out there for Big Pharma to really stick their noses in right now because there's been such a lack of research over the last 50 years. So I think as we start seeing more through projects like Project 21, which will give us more indications of what seems to be effective, I think actually they'll change tack, because what we've seen in our early data so far has shown that, you know, it's really helping a broad range of conditions. So I hope that that won't be the case.
And lastly, this is more of a, I think, more of a technical one. Could you use medical cannabis to regulate psychosis? I'm not sure. Yeah.
Interesting question. Yeah. So there's actually been some early research which looks at CBD and CBD's rich extracts on some of the negative and cognitive symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia. And they found some interesting results. So it actually, versus placebo, decreases some of those negative kinds of symptoms which are associated with it, and also increases cognition in schizophrenic patients. So it's early research, but yeah, there's evidence to the contrary. Most people hear about cannabis and psychosis and think it promotes it, but actually some of these compounds could actually help, because as I mentioned before, it's a homeostatic system, and so it can be leveraged and optimized in lots of ways to help lots of different conditions.
Rayyan, thank you so much. That's Rayyan Zafar. Thank you so much.